church, like not the denomination, but the story of this particular congregation. A story that you are now part of, whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer. Even if it's your first visit today, your path has crossed paths with this story. Origin stories are important parts of who we are. They help us understand where we are in the story of ourselves and how what we're doing fits in, and how what we do moves the plot along or connects or doesn't with what has happened before. First Unitarian's story begins in 1949, at least in this telling. That's the year. It begins in 1949 with a man named Felix Arnold, a man who, to the best of my knowledge, no one here now remembers knowing in person. We invoke his name fairly often whenever we mention the Arnold Room here on the church campus. That's one of our meeting rooms. And if you've looked around in the Arnold Room, you might have noticed a little plaque, a sign really, that tells us that he was the founder of First Unitarian. Felix Arnold was a high school principal in Grants, just down the road. He was also a graduate of Harvard Divinity School. Harvard has a long history of training progressive ministers. The university got its start for that purpose back in 1636. It was originally a school just for training ministers, for developing a learned clergy, as they still are wont to say, a learned clergy for the New England colonies. As controversy over Unitarianism happened in the early 1800s, Harvard took a de facto and controversial stand by hiring Henry Ware as its Hollis Professor of Divinity. Ware's predecessor had been a Trinitarian. Ware was a Unitarian. And Harvard has been training Unitarian and other progressive ministers ever since. Felix Arnold was not a clergy person, but that is where he had studied. And he lived in Grants, New Mexico, carrot capital of the United States. This was the year before Patty Martinez discovered uranium there. I know, right? Carrots, right, in Grants? Really? Turns out all that volcanic soil was perfect for them. Now, Grants was awfully different from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and from Boston. It was not as metropolitan, for sure. And I wonder if our liberal-minded school principal was feeling a little bit isolated there in the carrot capital. He did have at least one ally, though. Louise Pembroke was a teacher in Grants, and she also had some liberal religious ideas. Now, Grants, though, had a population of about 2,000 people, very small. So, when Felix and Louise got it in their minds that people in this area should have a liberal religious option, they decided to focus their efforts 80 miles up the road in Albuquerque. There had to be at least a few religious liberals there among the population of 90,000 in 1949. In May that year, Felix Arnold and Louise Pembroke put an ad in an Albuquerque newspaper inviting anybody who was interested to meet with them at the YWCA. Our records indicate that Felix contacted, quote, the Boston office, which probably means the American Unitarian Association on Beacon Street there. And he contacted them, and he found somebody who would come and speak with the group, somebody by the name of Francis Ricker, a minister. That's kind of fascinating. If you think about it, it's kind of amazing. Two people in Grants, New Mexico, had the idea that there should be a liberal religious group in Albuquerque, and they put an ad in the paper, and just with those things, nothing more than an idea and an ad that they cast out to see who'd bite, they got the Boston office to send a minister out to come and address the group. Now, who the group might be, Felix and Louise did not know. They hoped somebody would show up at that meeting. It turns out their efforts to form a new congregation was coming right at the beginning of the American Unitarian Association's fellowship movement. This was a time when the AUA was trying really actively to support and plant small groups of Unitarians all around the country, especially in the western half of the country. And they had some field staff dedicated to helping with that work. A fellowship was defined as a group of 10 or more people affiliated with Unitarianism who wished to meet regularly for lay-led services. No ministers. The groups were too small to support a minister. The night came to meet at the YWCA, and Felix, Louise, and Francis Ricker waited to see who, if anybody, would turn up besides whatever few friends they might have recruited. I imagine Felix and Louise must have been a little bit nervous, wondering if they'd gotten ahead of themselves by inviting a special speaker. But it didn't matter. When the time came to begin, 30 people had arrived. They were off to a great start. Felix Arnold's story has always reminded me of the Gospel of Matthew in the Christian Bible, where there's a story about how Jesus recruited his first disciples. Passing by 2 fishermen casting a net into the sea, Jesus calls out to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." And the people drop their nets and follow. Like those fishermen in the Jesus story, Arnold ended up giving up his livelihood to take this path. When the school officials in Grants heard what he was up to, they deemed him a heretic, unfit to lead a school, and they fired him. He had to go to work selling encyclopedias to get by while getting our church off the ground. And I've always liked to imagine him peddling his heretical theology door to door, along with those books back in 1950s Albuquerque. Before too long, Felix Arnold moved away, probably for work. As far as I can tell, we don't have any photographs of him, and even the research librarian at Harvard Divinity School was unable to find very much information about Felix Arnold. We do have a photo of Louise Pembroke, though. Here's one of her in the late 60s or early 70s with her husband, Ollie. After the YWCA meeting, a group formed that began to meet regularly at a member's home. A newspaper article from 1949 says they met at 123 South Walter, which appears to be this house, built in 1901. It's between Presbyterian Hospital and downtown, just off of Central Ave. The group didn't only invite Francis Ricker to speak. They also had representatives from other religious organizations come at different times, so they were in discernment. It was only later that year, according to a 1949 Albuquerque Journal article, that the group decided that they would be Unitarians. Now, there was no Unitarian Universalist group back then because the Unitarians and the Universalists had not yet merged. They were still 2 separate denominations. The article says, the Liberal Religious Fellowship, which apparently was the group's name at first, the Liberal Religious Fellowship will affiliate with the American Unitarian Association, members announced after a Sunday meeting of the organization. I am fascinated to imagine what else they might have decided on. That was an important fork in our road, but we have no record of the other speakers. The article continues, and it says the group will be known as the Unitarian Fellowship of Albuquerque. They met in that home for a while, but later, perhaps as they outgrew a parlor space, Temple Albert hosted them. Here's what Temple Albert looked like back then, this rounded dome, very ornate building. Our congregation still partners with Congregation Albert today, including on the annual Interfaith Thanksgiving service, which we are hosting this year, the Sunday before Thanksgiving. In its 1950 to 51 yearbook, the American Unitarian Association lists our congregation for the first time under the category of a fellowship. There we are. And it lists some statistics for us, too. That year, the congregation had 30 members, and its operating expenses were, wait for it, $398. Things were moving along nicely, even as the congregation literally had to keep moving. When Temple Albert was sold, the Unitarians moved to another space, something called the USO building. Their meeting space there was located right above a bowling alley, right next door to a jukebox, and right in front of the railroad tracks. You thought Carlisle was noisy, right? They learned their lesson. Next, they bought a small lot on San Mateo and Central for $1,600. Prices sure were lower back then, but the lot was also very, very small. It was 100 by 100 feet. In 1952, with help from a grant from the AUA, the group called their first minister the Reverend Franklin Smith. And now that they had a minister on board, they decided to officially incorporate as a church. A few years later, an unexpected opportunity came their way. It was the summer of 1955, and many members were away on vacation when 4.5 acres on the corner of Carlisle and Comanche became available. The cost was $15,000, much more than they'd been working with. And they had to act fast. The few members who were present saw the potential for that land, and they decided to go for it. One member took the risk upon his or herself and put up the cash and took out a mortgage that could be paid back by the church later. The decision to buy this land that we sit on now was pretty controversial in its time. Some members were afraid that it was way too far out in the middle of nowhere for anybody to come. A few people even left the congregation over it. That is hard to imagine now, right? But looking at a picture of the land after they had built on it, you can see why they were worried. The space they built included the Arnold Room and the Wesson Room, and I want to show you what the Wesson Room looked like in its early years. Stylish, dignified. Can you see that fireplace back in the corner? Here's what the parking lot looked like. Just the middle of nowhere. There's a road that goes off into the distance. In 1958, the average income was $4,500 a year. Minimum wage was $1 per hour. And this small group of people found the resources and the courage to buy this land and to start building this campus. The AUA's yearbook from 1959 to 60, 10 years after that first one, lists First Unitarian again, this time with a membership of 255 people and expenses just under $15,000. They were growing. The Reverend James Wilkes arrived in 1962. His first sermon was called A Right to Heresy. His installation sermon, which was delivered by another minister from Boston, was entitled A Ministry of Disturbance. They were our people, all right. At first, the congregation met on Sundays in what we now call Memorial Hall. That was the original sanctuary across the courtyard. But Wilkes was an activist, and he was a fiery preacher, and he attracted crowds that were way too big for that hall. So they decided to build a new sanctuary to accommodate their growth and to create the space they needed to continue with their mission as a spiritual home for religious liberals and as a force for good beyond those church doors. It was covered in the news. An article reports the church membership at 525 adults and 400 kids. The church had doubled in size in just 2.5 years. Here's the architectural model, with the architect Harvey Hoschauer and the minister James Wilkes, and William Parrish, who was the chair of that year's building committee. We have a library room called the Parrish Library, and now you know why. It's not a synonym for church library. It's named after a person, William Parrish. Hoschauer was a busy architect in Albuquerque. He also renovated the Chemo Theater downtown. For the Unitarian sanctuary, he set out to design something that would encourage religious thought beyond the limits of the building itself. Those are his words describing the design. A building with big windows and lots of light and beams wrapping around, creating connections from one side of the building to the other. Here's what it looked like when it was newly finished. Back in the news again after that. Oh, it was such a desolate campus. Look at that. Yeah. All the plantings we have been done by volunteers over the years. Here we are back in the news. It says, City Unitarians to use spacious new church for the first time. The building was an architectural landmark, and actually groups of architects still visit that building from time to time today. We have Louise Pembroke to thank for much of this historical information. Although her co-dreamer and co-conspirator, Felix Arnold, moved away, Louise remained part of this congregation for 54 years, until 2003. Her typed history of the church is part of our archives. I found some other little cool tidbits from the past. Harvard Divinity maintains an extensive archive of Unitarian and Universalist history, and they used to be on our newsletter mailing list. So the head research librarian, who's also a UU, sent me some images of our church newsletters from the 70s and 80s. Check out this March 17th, 1970 edition of The Messenger. Some things never change, like the name. And, for example, the folk dancers were meeting with Charlene Baker as their contact person. Charlene is still the contact person for the folk dancers today. There were lots of single groups back then, too, like the Singletarians. Other groups are harder to understand through the veil of the past. Here's news that a group called El Miércoles will be held on the first Tuesday of every month. Miércoles is Spanish for Wednesday. Huh. This week, I put Harvard Divinity back on our mailing list for newsletters for future historians. And in August, the Arts and Aesthetics team is going to hang a new show in the social hall. This one is a show of First Unitarian history, so you can take a closer look at some of our old photographs and see other images from the church archives. Now, if you are thinking that that new sanctuary you saw a few minutes ago looked a lot like our current social hall, then you must have joined the church just within the last several years, and you are right. In the early 2000s, First Unitarian began a new phase of innovation and growth. Attendance increased after 9/11, but unlike other congregations which experienced a bump and then a return to normal or close to it, First Unitarian's membership grew and then grew and grew some more. And soon our 1960s sanctuary was too small. In 2009, we worked with Mullen Heller Architecture to develop a master plan for our church campus, which would include building a new sanctuary and turning the old one into a social hall. In 2011, we held a capital campaign, and together we raised more money than had ever been raised by this congregation in its entire history, over $2 million, and we built this beautiful space that we're in right now. That's Christine Robinson, our senior minister who retired last year, and me standing in this exact spot on this platform. And it's hard to see in this picture, but one day everybody was invited to sign this beam, which is now over our heads. When you're a part of this place, you are really a part of this place, right? This sanctuary was designed to reflect and honor the values of the last one with light and openness. It has an echo of those big beams going across the ceiling, but this time they crisscross in a symbol of interdependence and connection. Right around the time we completed it, same-sex marriage became recognized by the state of New Mexico, and people started coming from neighboring states to make their unions official. The first wedding that took place in here was the marriage of two adorable men from Texas, complete with boots, jeans, and big cowboy hats. I met them in my office, and I asked them where on campus they wanted to do their ceremony, and at first they said, well, we thought we'd do it out in the courtyard because we'd like to keep our hats on. I said, you can wear your hats anywhere you want in this church, and I dragged them right up here to help us consecrate this space. It really is a sacred place. This whole campus is, and not just because of ceremonies or services, but because it's something precious that we've inherited from those who came before. We are temporary guardians of this place and of the mission of love and community and justice. And this space is made sacred whenever people from any walk of life are gathered here for the many expressions of that mission. When we moved into this sanctuary, we started using the old one as a social hall, but we never really turned it into one. The acoustics in there, which were just fine for preaching and music, are atrocious for coffee hour, right? The old mural wall takes up 30% of the floor space, and that once stunning building has become dated and worn out. The windows are not energy efficient. You can barely see through some of them. The swamp coolers are unreliable. Their roof is leaky. The kitchen has a special smell that you can't get out, and I cannot forget. It has appliances that have been described as intimidating. Recently, we've started looking around the campus and noticing that many spaces in this wonderful place had begun to look shabby. In the last year, we've improved the Weston and Arnold wing. Volunteers Melissa Naku and Martha Cattell have brought the Memorial Garden back to life. You should visit it sometime. It is just teeming with flowers right now. Memorial Hall has gotten a makeover thanks to the vision and the hard work of board member Donna Collins and thanks to small donations from about 20 members. The staff offices were remodeled to provide working space for every staff member. But the social hall is a large-scale project, and it's going to take all of us to remodel and restore that. That's why at the annual meeting this year, we voted to conduct a capital campaign for the fall. Time to put some love back into what we've received from those who came before us, this precious church. And it's not just ours. We share it as often as we can. On Friday, the Root Summer Leadership Academy kids gave their big performance right here on this platform. Mayor Tim Keller was here. And when he stood up to say a few words, the first words he said were words of gratitude for First Unitarian. He said that he is here all the time for community events, that he has observed how First Unitarian welcomes everyone, and that our campus functions almost like a community center. And then the kids just filled the space with creativity and feistiness and beauty and hope. This congregation has now been continuously gathered for 69 years. When our founders convened the very first meeting, we were just a few years past World War II. The scale of evil and destruction unleashed on the world in that war had shaken the very foundations of religion. This church was gathered for those and by those who wanted to worship, to ascribe value and worth to that which is worthy. They wanted to worship with courage, with eyes open and minds engaged and hands and hearts ready to serve, with vision and with radical generosity toward future generations. We honor and give thanks for those who came before and who prepared the way for us. And we recognize that there's no crisp division between past and present. It's continuously unfolding, and we're part of it. So let us dedicate ourselves to the mission and the care of this church, investing in its care, growing in our understanding of love and service, and practicing a faith that always moves beyond limits. May it be so. Will you join me in our closing hymn, Rising in Body or Spirit? It's number 1, a song of church blessing and rededication. Number 1.